Today I'm going to be talking about sex crimes. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what are the different types of sexual offenses. Some people, when they think of a sexual offense, their mind might go to rape or sexual assault, child molest, things like that. But there's actually a lot of different types of sexual offenses that you might not think of right off the top of your head. Some of those might be statutory rape or pimping, solicitation, prostitution. There's a pretty big sex trafficking issue going on right now, particularly in San Diego because we're a border state. All of those things can constitute a sexual offense. Also, indecent exposure to an adult or a minor, and child pornography. Just viewing it or downloading it is a federal offense. So, as I was talking about the diagnoses, usually those are paraphilias. Sometimes it could be another disorder, but usually it's paraphilias. So, I'm going to talk about what are the types and the sex offenses that they can lead to. One of the paraphilias is called frauderism, which is rubbing up against a person without their consent. That's pretty self-explanatory as far as what that could lead to. It's going to lead to some sort of assault or maybe an indecent exposure if they expose themselves while they rub up against the person. But usually it's just they have all their clothes on and they like to rub up against people. So if somebody feels someone rub up against them on the bus and they realize that someone's getting aroused by that, they might report it to the police. But a lot of these don't get reported because it's just some kind of creepy person in a public area who rubs up against somebody. The person might not even notice that the person is doing it for that reason. Another type of paraphilia is voyeurism. So that might lead to a peeping sort of crime where someone's looking in windows and watching people undressing, things like that. Exhibitionism is when people enjoy exposing themselves to other people in public, usually. So that could obviously lead to indecent exposure cases, and it could be towards adults or children, depending on what the person is attempting to do. But they enjoy surprising or upsetting people with that act. That's part of what they enjoy about exposing themselves. Sexual sadism is enjoying inflicting physical or psychological suffering upon a person. So that would have to do with violent sort of acts like rape or assaults, things of that nature. And so I'm going to talk about pedophilia. There's a lot of misconceptions about pedophilia. It's the desire, urge, or use of children for sexual excitement, but it has to be persistent. If a psychologist is evaluating someone and they only have evidence that the person has viewed maybe, let's say, 2 images or 3 images of child pornography, and they actually have far more adult pornography on their computer, they may not qualify for a pedophilia diagnosis. It has to be persistent. So they have to have shown a pattern of being interested in prepubescent children. Then there's also hebephilia, which is young postpubescent children, and ephebophilia, which is mid to late adolescent age. There's been research done that shows that adult males can be attracted to older teenagers, but it's still against the law, so that's not an excuse. It's just considered normal within the range of sexual interest. So they wouldn't necessarily qualify for a diagnosis of pedophilia if that's the case. People who are pedophiles or qualify for the diagnosis of pedophilia, they might collect child pornography. That's a pretty common thing among people who are interested in children because they view it as less harmful. They view it as something where there's no victim, but we all know that there is a real child that's being abused, and viewing it, perpetuating perpetuates that. So it's kind of like a degree of separation that they feel that they can do this. And it's also more available. They don't have to go out and search for a victim. Some men who do watch child pornography are married. They have sexual relationships with age-appropriate females, and then they collect child pornography in secret. The other thing is that a lot of people teach their kids about like stranger danger, and in reality, it's more likely that someone that the child knows would actually sexually act out against the child, somebody that they have interactions with, a family member, a friend, a teacher, things of that nature. And we've all heard about people in power who take advantage of their positions and use their power for that purpose, which is really unfortunate and can really affect the child in a really negative way. And then we don't normally think of women who have sex with adolescent boys as child molesters or pedophiles, but it does constitute a sex offense under the definition. And so we've all heard in the media there's women who maybe are younger, in their early 20s or late 20s, who get involved with a student. That's a pretty common example. And then they're charged with statutory rape, and they have to undergo a sex offender evaluation to see if they need to get on the registry, what their risk is. And it can be just as traumatic to boys as girls. It just is viewed by our society differently. So, in prison, there are certain norms that are different than outside of prison, and it's important to know if you're working with a correctional population or have contact with correctional inmates how a sex offense can impact their stay in a prison. An inmate that is convicted of a sex offense can be in danger in prison, and you'll see on the videos I posted one account of someone getting very badly beaten. It doesn't always happen that way because the prisons have implemented a lot of protections for those people. A lot of times they're placed on sensitive needs yards or SNY yards. It depends on the race of the person. Also, some races are more tolerant of certain crimes. That's based on my experience. There isn't really research necessarily to back that up, but gangs tend to be extremely intolerant of anyone convicted of a sexual offense. It doesn't really matter the type. A lot of inmates assume if you've been convicted of a sex offense that it's against a child. They just automatically assume that it's against a child, even if it could be against an adult. They don't care. They just label you as a child molester right when they see the sex offense. That's not necessarily the case. People who are convicted of a sex offense, they generally try to hide that they were convicted of that, and they don't advertise it, obviously. They try to keep it secret, but sometimes when people are first placed in prison, their cellmate will ask for their credentials, or basically they ask them to see their paperwork, and it's because the cellmate wants to know what they did. And if they were convicted of a sex offense, particularly one against a child, they can be in serious danger of getting beaten up or killed. It's a pretty serious thing in prison that isn't really tolerated. So that's why they created these sensitive needs yards. They're generally they consist of several different groups of people. One of them is sex offenders. But there's also transgender inmates that go on sensitive needs yards and gang dropouts that go on those yards. So it's an interesting mix of people. And they're, just because they're gang dropouts doesn't mean that they're not going to join another gang while they're on a sensitive needs yard. There's been a problem with dropout gangs. So the people who've dropped out of their original gang now created a new gang on the sensitive needs yard, which is an interesting problem going on. Although being transgender doesn't really have to do with sex crimes, I'm going to talk about it briefly just because it does have an impact on prison culture. So, transgender inmates, like I said, are placed on sensitive needs yard. If they have already completely had a gender reassignment surgery, they would be in a female prison, but if they still have male genitalia, they go to a male prison. Some of them have breast implants, and they wear a bra, and they have long hair, so they appear to be, they look like a woman, but they still have male genitalia. So these inmates are at risk, so they're placed on the sensitive need yard because they're at risk, and they can be really at risk to being sexually assaulted or beaten up because they look how they look. And so you might have seen some documentaries or things on the media about people not having rights in prison as far as being transgender, but they actually do allow them to have long hair. When I worked at Donovan, actually all the inmates were allowed to wear their hair however they wanted. Some prisons do require them to shave their head, but I think that they're moving away from that now. So that's just something to keep in mind. So next I'm going to talk about recidivism. Recidivism is when someone commits an offense and then they say get out of prison. It's them committing another offense. That's being a recidivist or committing a recidivist act. So it could say someone's committed a sex crime. They could commit another sex offense, or it could be a non-sexual offense. Both are considered recidivism, but most sex offenders are more likely to recidivate in the form of a non-sexual offense. There are some problems with measuring recidivism. Many sex offenses aren't reported, so recidivism rates can be difficult to measure, especially with sexual assaults. One study showed that only 19% of women and 13% of men that were raped after their 18th birthday reported their rape. That was done in 2006. So it's important to keep in mind that some of these things aren't reported, and that can affect the statistics. The other thing to keep in mind is the longer a period of time that's measured, the higher percentage of recidivism there will be, which makes sense logically. If you measure a 10-year period of time, there's going to be more opportunity to commit crimes because it's a longer period of time. So there was a study by Heal and colleagues in 2009 that reported recidivism at 5 and 10-year intervals were 3.9 and 10.8% for sex offenses, and this is for sex offenders. The other percentages they gave were 26.3 and 38.1%, the 5 and 10 year for violent crimes, and 52.6 and 77.7 for any type of arrest. So the more specific, the lower the percentage usually. If you look at all crimes, it's going to be higher. So that's just some information on recidivism.